The Politics of Aristotle, a work of political philosophy first transcribed between 336 and 322 BC. The principal ideas are that the morally virtuous man performs acts according to a rational mean between extremes of excess and deficiency, so also does the state. The good states are monarchies, aristocracies, and polities, constitutional governments. The corresponding bad states are tyrannies, oligarchies, and radical democracies. Polities which lean toward the democratic form of government possess the greatest political stability and are least liable to revolutions. The art of government involves the use of practical wisdom. Since the best life is one which combines action with contemplation, the ideal state aims at providing sufficient eternal goods to permit the pursuit of virtue and happiness. Descriptions of actually existing states are combined in Aristotle's Politics with judgments about ideal political community. Its 8 separate books make up a work which most scholars insist the author never intended as one finished product. There is debate about the ordering of the existing books, but in spite of the work's variety of special topics, several dominant themes and interests prevail throughout. One theme is the characteristic Aristotelian stress upon the purposive quality of political life, the view that a state, like any other entity in nature, has a nature understandable in terms of a purpose. Consequently, one cannot properly determine the nature of citizenship unless you first know what, in general and particular, the state is established to accomplish. Another yet related theme concerns the way in which political life is viewed as an important organized means to the ethical development of its members. Though the state is logically prior to the individual, according to Aristotle, its purpose centers in the production of the maximum human good. The Politics presupposes the ethical teachings found in Aristotle's famous work on ethical life. The primary question for Aristotle is not whether men will act politically, since it is their nature so to act, but rather whether they will act well. Aristotle's insistence on the natural basis of human political activity accounts for his central concern with the proper education of the state's citizens. Learning is induced by nature, habit, and reason. Education can influence habit and reason by modifying man's natural capacities, directing them to selected ends or kinds of action. Aristotle's conception of the way in which human ethical capacities develop affects what he says about human political roles. 2 broad classes of ethical facts exist, one of them moral, the other intellectual. These classes are interdependent. The moral virtues are learned. They result from habitual kinds of conduct. The morally virtuous man performs acts according to a rational mean between extremes of excess and deficiency, which require prudential judgments in specific contexts demanding action. The chief aim of the moral virtues is action rather than contemplation, doing rather than theorizing. Political activity expresses the range of virtuous actions insofar as man, as a political animal, must live in associations and devote attention to the family, to public affairs of a commonwealth. The matter of what makes good citizenship possible is a complicated one. The reason is that good citizenship must occur in relation to some actually existing state of which there may be different kinds. Thus there can be good citizens of bad states. Good citizenship need not coincide with human goodness. A man who is a good citizen of a bad state will acquire a character which produces acts foreign to the character of the morally good man. Although Aristotle preferred a state which encouraged moral activity on the part of its members, he showed sufficient realism to recognize the possibility of a wide range of states and to admit that citizenship exists as a function of the end sought after by any actual existing state. Aware of the conditions needed to produce an ideal state, Aristotle nonetheless wanted also to describe and to classify existing and possible types of political units. Aristotle's sense of the variety of political possibilities becomes clear in his criticisms of Plato's utopian scheme, sketched so brilliantly in the latter's Republic. He disagrees with Plato's abolition of private property and his advocacy of social communism of wives and children. Aristotle insists that Plato's recommendations are wrong in terms of both their end and their means. There can be too great a unity in any existing state. Plato's political thought wrongfully sought after an impossible kind of unity in suggesting abolition of property and the private family. Such recommendations could never lead, as means, to the minimal unity any state requires. They would increase the chances of dissension in the state. Aristotle argues that differentiation of functions is a law of nature, that things actually differ. Political philosophers must accept this fact and not seek to alter the unalterable. In the Laws, written later than the Republic, Plato softened some earlier political suggestions by abandoning his theory of social communism. Aristotle also criticizes the Laws on several grounds. It fails to discuss foreign relations, it makes new states too large in territory, and it fails to limit property, population, or the respective roles of ruler and subject. Just as Aristotle insists that philosophers must never seek greater certainty in ethics than the subject matter permits, so he argues that the political philosopher must recognize that judgments must conform to an inevitable relativity in types of political systems. Since there are many forms of government, Aristotle asserts in Book 3 of the Politics, there must be many varieties of citizens, and especially of citizens who are subjects. Nonetheless, he agrees with Plato that the best states, however specialized the functions of their citizens, seek the common interests of all. When he describes existing states of his own day and age, Aristotle mentions the three which he considers best: Sparta, Crete, Carthage. During his lifetime, Aristotle also directed a study of the various constitutions, showing his interest in the empirical details of political life. Yet his empirically minded studies never paralyzed his independent judgments about the values of what he studied. Thus Aristotle pointed out that Sparta was fit only for conducting war. The Cretan state was too narrowly a rule of the rich and oligarchy, whose cities remained safe only because of their accidental geographical inaccessibility. And the Carthaginian state relied on a policy of emigration to keep down domestic insurrection. The best existing states fail to measure up to what is possible. Aristotle realized that a description of what exists politically need not suffice either as a basis for classifying possible types of states or as a means of making clear the nature of an ideal state. In various portions of his Politics he devotes attention to such matters. Like Plato, Aristotle claims that there are three broad types of states, each possessing a corresponding possible perversion. The so-called good types are monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. The corresponding perversions, the so-called bad types of these, are tyranny, oligarchy, radical democracy. By radical democracy, Aristotle means a state which permits an absolutely unrestricted manhood suffrage and the right of all, without qualification to hold office. This classificatory scheme hides a great complexity, especially of degree, since Aristotle thinks both monarchy and aristocracy allow for at least 5 possible forms. The classification also contains puzzles. One is that though oligarchy is listed as a possible perversion of aristocracy, Aristotle indicates that the best state, practically though not ideally, is a polity. A polity is defined as a state which mixes rule by the rich with rule by the poor. Ideally then, the polity requires the existence of a significantly entrenched middle class, whose interests moderate the extremes and receive furtherance through the state's machinery. A polity therefore requires a constitution which expresses elements of oligarchic interests. To achieve a balance between oligarchy and democracy is difficult. The reason is that each type of state emphasizes a different end. Oligarchy rests on the assumption that men's political rights ought not to be equal but rather based proportionally on their possession of wealth. Democracy stresses human equality, that each shall count as one in political affairs. Neither is absolutely correct. Virtue stands as the sole general aim of statecraft, meaning that any form of political organization which produces virtuous conduct is politically justifiable. Aristotle understood that polity results from a compromise. It involves a mixed constitution. Polities may come into being in several different ways, but their constitutions must find a mean which mingles some property qualifications with offices open to lot or election. Aristotle's comments about the value of a polity result in part from his unwillingness to consider absolute kingship the best political unit. Admitting that an absolute king who rules according to the spirit of law produces an excellent model for governing, Aristotle suggests that the rule of law receives less abuse if reserved for many citizens. He objects to monarchy because, in his estimation, it evolved as a response to the problems of a primitive social order. Monarchy often becomes simply hereditary. Its additional weaknesses are that it is subject to the passions of a single man and that no king can adequately handle all the affairs of ruling. The need of continuity and stability in a state receives ample recognition in Aristotle's Politics. Yet all political systems are subject to revolutions. Existing forms of government share 2 general aims: an acknowledgement of justice and proportionate equality. Men fail to translate these aims of government into adequate practice, producing conditions from which revolutions spring. In one example, Aristotle shows how the democrat's emphasis on equality leads him to think that men are equal in all things, while the oligarch's insistence on human inequality spurs him to claim too much for himself. In any state in which both the equalities among men and their inequalities fail to receive proper balancing, hardened parties tend to arise which encourage revolution on behalf of a more thorough realization of their own partial interests. The citizens possessing the highest right to rebel, men who stand out for their virtuous conduct, are those who by their nature seem least willing to take part in rebellions. A student of revolutions needs to understand first the general feeling or attitude of those who rebel, second, the second motivation of any rebellion, its objects, and third, the immediate factors which cause the rebellion. In all revolutions, a general cause exists in the desire for equality. This leads inferiors to revolt in hopes of attaining equality. It also causes men who are genuinely capable to rebel to achieve superiority over those who are, in fact, not their equals. The motivation for rebellion centers around the desire of gain and honor, or the fear of dishonor and loss. The authors of them want to divert punishment or dishonor from themselves or their friends. Other causes play important roles. These causes of revolution include contempt, fear, insolence, increase in some aspect of the state which is disproportionate, and excessive superiority. Other kinds of causes of rebellion include intrigues at elections, unjust differences in the elements in the state, lack of care, and neglect of trivial issues over a period of time. What causes an actual revolution depends often on the type of constitution involved. For examples, Aristotle claims that democracies usually enter revolutionary times because of the demagogic intemperance of the leaders. Oligarchic states must guard against revolution producing causes of two kinds: severe oppression of the people and personal political rivalries between important oligarchs in the state. Revolutions occur in aristocratic states when too few qualify for honours. In constitutional states, when the constitution itself permits lack of justice. Aristotle insists that mixed constitutions which lean toward the democratic possess, in general, the greatest stability. The analysis of the causes of revolution leads Aristotle to consider how constitutions may be preserved. Obedience to the spirit of existing law requires planned defense in any moderately stable state. Such obedience extends even to small matters. Like Plato, Aristotle shows suspicion of alteration when he writes that men should guard against the beginning of change. This remark shows that despite his awareness of variety, Aristotle adopted a conservative political stance. In democracies, offices should rotate frequently, and a number of institutions are required in cases where the governing class is numerous. Aristotle advocates a fairly wide personal participation in government. He wrote for a small Greek city-state, limited in territory and numbers. For this reason, many of his observations about participation in governing seem irrelevant or foreign to the modern states, whose extensive territories require an underpinning of bureaucratic machinery. Aristotle makes clear, however, that magistrates and others who perform public offices should never make money. Public service should exist as a self-justifying activity of the virtuous citizen. The moral tone of much of Aristotle's treatment of politics is apparent in his recommendations about the qualifications of men who wish to hold office in the state. In each existing state, an office holder must show loyalty to the contents of the constitution. He must also possess administrative abilities of a high order and express the kind of virtues that his particular state requires. In the case of democratic governments, Aristotle never makes clear how office holding by lot or election can guarantee that able administrators will rule. He does insist that only those who are citizens can qualify for office, and from the citizen body he excludes slaves and mechanics. Aristotle shares the cultural prejudices of his own age when he confines the virtues of the governing class, the citizen body, to the well-born and the aristocratic. A reliance on common sense runs through the politics. Aristotle realizes that once the purposes of governing are understood, in principle, any state requires the practical wisdom of a sound statesman. Individual men must apply their knowledge of principles to specific situations. At this point, the art of governing passes beyond the sphere of scientific prediction and control. Indeed, Aristotle makes clear that each and every form of state is subject to change and possible revolution, including the most tyrannically controlled states. He also indicates an unusual sensitivity to the ways in which any political form, say democracy, must adapt itself to the special geographical and cultural circumstances with which it must in practice operate. In the final portion of the Politics, books 7 and 8, Aristotle discusses the way in which to form an ideal state as well as the educational practices necessary for the maintenance once established. The treatment of these issues depends upon Aristotle's conception of man's nature. The human soul, psyche, contains an element which is subservient to a rational principle of control. This is the desiring aspect of human nature which is amenable to command and persuasion. Each man also possesses a unique capacity for rational comprehension. The best life, in Aristotle's view, is that which combines action with contemplation. The happy man will enjoy external goods, goods of the body, spiritual, intellectual goods in some appropriate proportion. Goods of the soul exist as that to which the other goods are a necessary and enjoyable means. Individuals and states need sufficient external goods to permit the pursuit of virtue and happiness. Aristotle treats such a view as axiomatic, beyond argument. To the question of which is the more preferable, the life of a philosopher or that of a statesman, Aristotle's answer is that political activity is not degrading, though political power can never stand as the highest good. Aristotle claims that natural capacities, developed in a proper order, can lead to the realization of the philosopher's ideal of wisdom. An important aspect of Aristotle's attitude toward the functions of political philosophizing is the manner in which he relates its aims to common sense. The political philosopher acts not so much like the scientific theorist discovering new theories, as like the practical man who rediscovers the applicability of rules evolved in the history of political communities. When he discusses the formation of an ideal state, Aristotle considers a small state. Its population and territory must be controlled. There must be a sufficient economic base to make the state self-sufficient. Agricultural work, mechanics, artisans, men of commerce are excluded from the body of the citizens. Slaves possess no rights at all. Only soldiers, priests, and rulers qualify for the rights of citizenship. These groups alone own land. Each citizen, in addition, should perform the functions of soldiering, act as priests, and rule at different periods of his life cycle. A hard distinction should hold between rulers, citizens, and subjects, non-citizens. In addition, in any ideally formed state, attention is given to the city's planning from the standpoint of utility and beauty. Education functions to perpetuate the state. Potential citizens learn to obey in order later to know how to rule. The legislative body of the state holds responsibility for the education of the citizens. The aim again is the production of the good man. The humanistic aim of well-rounded human development of all man's capacities is emphasized. Physical fitness is encouraged to stimulate practical and contemplative efforts. The legislative body exercises a moral watchfulness over the content of the music and tales heard by the potential citizens. Legislators control the age of marriage, determine the physical requirements of parentage, decide when exposure takes place, the Greek practice of putting infants out to die, and oversee the duration of existing marriages. These educational arrangements serve for Aristotle as necessary ingredients in the political perpetuation of the state. The lasting feature of Aristotle's politics are its emphasis on the moral justification of a state and the way in which its author accepts the inevitability of a wide range of existing states. Through the work also runs a firm defense of common sense, as the touchstone of all political philosophizing. Aristotle attempted to make sense out of politics rather than to impress individuals by preferring complicated theories. There can be no blueprint guiding the statesman's prudential judgments. Aristotle's classical work has inspired men in different times and women and places when political events have forced them to seek sanity rather than drama in their political thought. Excellent point, if I do say so myself. The end.